My name is Ruth, and I am 70 years old. As a retired nonprofit director, I dedicated my career to ethical leadership and strategic philanthropy, spending 38 years making tangible positive impacts in our community. I meticulously managed our family finances with the same precision I brought to overseeing million-dollar charitable foundations. Arthur and I shared what seemed like a transparent, loving marriage built on open communication and shared values. Our $3 million estate, carefully accumulated over 4 decades of hard work and wise investments, was always intended for our children's future, a legacy built on trust and mutual respect. Then, just 3 weeks after Arthur's funeral, when I was still struggling to navigate life without my partner of 42 years, our family lawyer revealed a devastating secret that shattered everything I thought I knew about my husband and my family. Arthur had created a second secret will that left 80% of our estate, nearly $2.5 million, to a veterans charity called Hope and Healing, leaving only $300,000 for each of our children, Mark and Lisa. My children, who had been anticipating inheritances of $1.5 million each, were instantly transformed from grieving family members into rage-filled strangers driven by shocking greed. Mark, fueled by his wife, Brenda's relentless ambition, screamed at me with a fury that made me step backward in fear. "This is a fake. You're a fool. You have no humanity left for your own children who desperately need this money. I have $100,000 in personal debt that depends on this inheritance." Lisa, typically quieter, but equally desperate due to $50,000 in credit card debt, looked at me with tears in her eyes and whispered, "Mom, please, just contest it. We can't survive without that money." In that moment, everything I thought I knew about my marriage, my family, and my life crumbled around me. My husband had kept life-changing secrets from me. My children saw me not as their grieving mother, but as an obstacle to their financial security. My integrity, built over decades of ethical leadership, was being questioned by the people who should have trusted me most. Yet as their lawyer, Mr. Davies, threatened public shaming and character assassination if I didn't cooperate with their plan to contest the will, something deep inside me began to stir. The same ethical rigor that had guided my nonprofit career, the same commitment to truth and justice that had defined my professional life, ignited a cold fury that surprised even me. What Mark, Lisa, Brenda, and their aggressive lawyer didn't know was my secret weapon extensive personal journals, documenting Arthur's growing philanthropy over his final years, his increasing disillusionment with our children's materialism, and most crucially, my discreet home security system that had captured Arthur's final conversations with his attorney, explicitly detailing his true intentions for the secret will. My trusted network of colleagues from decades of nonprofit work was waiting to be called upon. This time, their calculated plot to destroy Arthur's noble legacy and steal from veterans in need wouldn't just unravel, it would expose their shocking lack of empathy and reclaim not just my dignity, but my husband's final, most meaningful act of generosity. The confrontation that would define the rest of my life took place in my own living room, surrounded by the photographs and mementos of a 42-year marriage that I was beginning to realize had been built on secrets I was only now discovering. 3 days after the lawyer's revelation about Arthur's secret will, Mark arrived at my front door with Brenda in tow, their faces set with the kind of determination that immediately made me understand this was not a family discussion, but an ambush. I had been hoping for a quiet, private conversation where we could process our grief together and try to understand Arthur's motivations for this unexpected decision. Instead, I found myself facing what felt like a hostile takeover of my own home, with Brenda immediately taking control of the conversation in a way that made it clear she saw me as an opponent to be defeated rather than a mother-in-law to be respected. "Ruth," Brenda announced before she had even fully entered the living room, "we need to talk about this ridiculous situation Arthur has created. Mark and I have been discussing this extensively, and we've determined that there are only two possible explanations for this so-called will. Either it's completely fraudulent, or you were complicit in manipulating Arthur during his final months." The casual cruelty of her words spoken in my own home, while Arthur's favorite reading chair still held the impression of his body, took my breath away. This was the woman I had welcomed into our family 12 years ago, whom I had supported through her difficult early years of marriage to Mark, whom I had treated with the same love and respect I would have shown a biological daughter. Mark, standing behind his wife like a soldier following orders, had transformed from the gentle son I had raised into someone I barely recognized. His face was contorted with a rage that made me instinctively step backward, and when he began speaking, his voice carried a venom that cut deeper than any physical blow. "Mom, you let him do this to us," he screamed, his voice echoing off the walls where family portraits documented decades of love and shared experiences. "This is obviously a fake. This charity is nothing, just some made-up organization that probably doesn't even exist. You're losing your mind if you think Dad would actually cut us out of our inheritance for some random veterans he never even mentioned." His words came faster and louder as his fury built to a crescendo that left me trembling. "You're a fool, and you're stealing our money for some unknown cause. You have no humanity left for your own children who desperately need this money. I have a personal loan of $100,000 that depends on this inheritance. My entire financial future was built on the assumption that we would receive our fair share of Dad's estate." Brenda, seeing my shock and distress, moved in for what felt like a calculated killing blow. "Honestly, Ruth," she said, with the kind of chilling contempt that seemed designed to strip away whatever dignity I had left, "you were always too soft, too easily manipulated. This charity is obviously a scam, and you're either completely complicit in this fraud, or you've become utterly senile. Either way, you're a liability to this family, and you're letting our financial future slip away because you can't think clearly anymore." I tried to respond with the same calm, rational voice I had used in countless board meetings and donor presentations, hoping to appeal to whatever remained of their love for Arthur and their respect for his character. "Mark, Lisa," I said, though Lisa hadn't yet arrived, and I was addressing mainly empty air. "Your father was a man of deep principles, not just someone who accumulated money for its own sake. This charity, Hope and Healing, helps veterans with PTSD, a cause he had been secretly supporting for years. He didn't cut you out of anything. He had a vision that extended beyond just material wealth." I pulled out some of the documentation I had found in Arthur's desk letters from the charity describing the work they were doing, thank you notes from veterans whose lives had been changed by their programs, evidence of Arthur's growing involvement in a cause that had clearly meant more to him than he had ever shared with our family. But my attempts at explanation were met with scorn and dismissal that made it clear they had already decided on their narrative and were not interested in any facts that might contradict it. At that moment, Lisa finally arrived, and the sight of her gave me a brief moment of hope that perhaps one of my children would show some interest in understanding rather than just attacking. Instead, Lisa slumped into a chair with her face in her hands, and when she finally looked up at me, her eyes held not curiosity or grief, but desperation. "Mom, please," she whispered in a voice so quiet I had to strain to hear her. "Just contest it. We need the money. We have $50,000 in credit card debt that we can't handle without this inheritance. We're struggling to keep our heads above water financially." Before I could respond to Lisa's plea, my phone rang and Mark answered it without asking my permission. It was Mr. Davies, their lawyer, whose voice carried such authority and aggression that I could hear every word, even though he was supposedly speaking privately to Mark. "Mrs. Peterson," he said, addressing me directly, though I hadn't been part of the call. "Contesting this will is your only rational option. Your children have a strong legal claim to their rightful inheritance, especially if you cooperate with our investigation into the suspicious circumstances surrounding this document. However, if you choose to stand in the way of justice, we will have no choice but to expose your role in this questionable transaction." The threat was clear and devastating. Cooperate with their attack on Arthur's final wishes, or face public humiliation and character assassination that could destroy the reputation I had spent decades building in our community. But the systematic assault on my dignity was only beginning. Over the following days, I discovered that Brenda had already begun spreading rumors throughout our social circle, suggesting that I was either financially reckless, mentally incompetent, or under some kind of undue influence from the charity. Women I had known for decades began treating me with a mixture of pity and suspicion that made even simple errands feel like running a gauntlet of whispered conversations and meaningful glances. Mark and Brenda escalated their campaign by demanding immediate access to all of Arthur's personal papers, claiming that they needed to search for evidence of manipulation or fraud. When I hesitated, pointing out that some of his documents were private and that I needed time to process my own grief, they accused me of hiding something and threatened to get a court order if I didn't comply voluntarily. Most painfully, they began systematically isolating me from my grandchildren, interceding my phone calls and visits with explanations that the children were too upset by the family conflict to see me. 8-year-old Emma and 10-year-old Samuel, who had been spending weekends with Arthur and me for years, suddenly became unavailable, their absence creating an echo of loneliness in a house that already felt too empty without Arthur's presence. The final insult came when I discovered that Mark and Brenda had actually entered my home while I was at the grocery store and removed several items from Arthur's study, claiming them as family heirlooms that belonged to Mark as the eldest son. Among the missing items was Arthur's father's pocket watch, a treasured family piece that Arthur had planned to pass down through our family, but had never formally designated in his will. "We're just protecting Dad's legacy," Mark explained when I confronted him about the theft. "You're clearly not in a mental state to be trusted with valuable family items, and we can't risk having them disappear into the hands of strangers." As I sat alone in my living room that evening, surrounded by the gaps where Arthur's possessions had been, and the silence where my grandchildren's laughter should have filled the space, I felt the full weight of my isolation and betrayal. In less than a week, I had gone from being a respected widow, processing her grief, to being treated like a confused old woman whose judgment couldn't be trusted and whose motives were automatically suspect. But somewhere beneath the shock and heartbreak, the part of me that had spent 38 years fighting for justice and protecting vulnerable people was beginning to stir. I was Ruth Peterson, and I had not spent decades building ethical, nonprofit organizations just to be defeated by my own family's greed and manipulation. The fight for Arthur's legacy and for my own dignity was about to begin. The escalation of Mark and Brenda's campaign against me reached new levels of cruelty during the second week after Arthur's secret will was revealed. What had begun as family anger and disappointment transformed into a calculated public relations war designed to destroy my credibility and create a legal foundation for overturning Arthur's final wishes. The first shot across the bow came in the form of a formal press release that Brenda distributed to our local newspaper, several community organizations where Arthur and I had been active, and the social media networks that connected our circle of friends and colleagues. The release, written with the polish of someone who understood how to manipulate public opinion, announced their intention to seek justice for a beloved family patriarch whose final wishes were corrupted by outside influences. Arthur Peterson was a man of integrity who deeply loved his family, the statement read. His wife, Ruth, who had been showing signs of increasing confusion and poor judgment in recent months, was unfortunately taken advantage of by unscrupulous charity representatives who manipulated both her grief and her husband's declining mental state to redirect family assets for their own benefit. Reading those words, seeing my 42-year marriage and Arthur's generous heart reduced to a narrative of manipulation and mental decline, felt like being stabbed in the chest. Every phrase was carefully crafted to plant seeds of doubt about my competence while portraying Mark and Lisa as protective children trying to salvage their father's true legacy. But the public campaign was only the beginning. Brenda had also begun making strategic phone calls to key figures in our community, people whose opinions carried weight and whose voices could influence others. I learned about these conversations through friends who called to ask if I was doing okay and if there was anything they should know about the situation. Brenda mentioned that you might be experiencing some memory issues. One longtime friend told me during what was supposed to be a casual coffee meeting. She seemed really concerned about whether you're getting proper medical care and support during this difficult time. The implication was clear. I was being portrayed as a confused, vulnerable widow who couldn't be trusted to understand complex legal documents or make sound financial decisions. Every natural sign of grief or stress was being reframed as evidence of cognitive decline. Every moment of sadness or confusion was being used as proof that I was unfit to honor Arthur's actual wishes. The systematic destruction of my reputation might have continued indefinitely if I hadn't overheard a phone conversation that revealed the true scope of their calculation and manipulation. I was in my garden trying to find some peace among the flowers Arthur and I had planted together when Brenda's voice carried through the open window of Mark's car as she sat in my driveway making calls. It was so easy to make her doubt herself, Brenda was saying to someone on the other end of the line, her voice carrying a satisfaction that made my blood run cold. The old bat's completely lost it since Arthur died. She's so isolated and confused that she'll believe anything we tell her. Now we control the entire narrative, especially when it comes to the money. There was a pause as she listened to the other person. Then she continued with a laugh that contained no humor, only cruel calculation. Ruth's reputation in this community was built over decades, but reputations can be destroyed much faster than they're built. By the time we're finished, no one will trust her judgment about anything, much less her ability to understand Arthur's real intentions. The chilling clarity of her words hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't about protecting Arthur's memory or ensuring his true wishes were honored. This was about absolute ruthless financial exploitation, using my grief and my community standing as weapons in a war I hadn't even realized was being waged against me. As I sat there in my garden, hidden behind the rose bushes Arthur had pruned just months before his death, I was forced to confront a devastating truth about the sacrifice I had made to protect our family's reputation and Arthur's career. The irony was almost too cruel to bear. 28 years ago, when Arthur was building his political career and our family's public standing, he became involved in what could have been a devastating scandal. A campaign finance violation involving nearly $250,000 in misreported donations and undisclosed conflicts of interest threatened to destroy not just his political aspirations, but our entire family's reputation in the community. I discovered the extent of the problem when I was reviewing our personal finances and found discrepancies that led me to bank records and documents Arthur had tried to hide. The scope of the ethical violations was breathtaking, and the potential consequences included criminal charges, public disgrace, and the complete destruction of everything we had worked to build. But instead of confronting Arthur with what I had discovered, instead of demanding explanations or threatening to leave him, I made a choice that would define the rest of our marriage. Using my expertise in nonprofit financial management and my network of contacts in the philanthropic community, I quietly orchestrated a series of complex financial maneuvers designed to cover the scandal and make it disappear. I liquidated a $500,000 inheritance I had received from my grandmother money I had been saving for our children's education and our family's future security. I used those funds to create a series of legitimate charitable donations and financial transfers that retroactively explained the missing money and eliminated any paper trail that could lead back to Arthur's violations. More than that, I spent months of my life creating false documentation coaching Arthur on explanations for his financial decisions and using my reputation and relationships to deflect any investigations before they could gain momentum. I sacrificed my own integrity, my financial security, and my peace of mind to protect a man who had lied to me and endangered our family through his reckless choices. Arthur never knew the full extent of what I had done to save him. I allowed him to believe that the scandal had blown over naturally, that his explanations had been accepted, that his political career had survived through his own skill and luck, rather than through my systematic deception and financial sacrifice. For 28 years, I had carried the weight of that secret, had lived with the knowledge that our comfortable life and respected reputation were built on lies I had told, and money I had spent to cover up my husband's moral failures. And now, as I listened to Brenda plotting to destroy my reputation and steal money that was meant to help veterans, the bitter irony was almost unbearable. I had sacrificed my integrity to protect Arthur's image, and now my children were attempting to destroy that same image, to steal money from people who needed it far more than they did. Every choice I had made, every compromise I had accepted, every lie I had told had been to preserve a family that was now tearing itself apart over greed and entitlement. When I tried to subtly reference Arthur's growth and change over the years, his evolution from the ambitious politician to the generous philanthropist, Mark's response revealed how completely he had embraced Brenda's narrative of my supposed mental decline. "Mom, you're always trying to control Dad's story, even now that he's dead," he snapped with a cruelty that would have been unimaginable just weeks earlier. "Just let it go. This isn't about your fantasies of who Dad was or what he wanted. This is about our money, our inheritance, our financial security. Stop trying to turn him into some kind of saint when he was just a man who made a mistake in his final will." Brenda's response was even more calculated in its dismissal. "Honestly, Ruth, you're getting quite paranoid about all of this. We're genuinely concerned about your mental health and your ability to process reality. You're losing your grip on what's actually happening here." Even Lisa, who I had hoped might show some interest in understanding, rather than just attacking, reinforced their narrative with her tearful but firm refusal to consider any explanation that didn't result in more money for the family. Mom, I can't afford to care about Dad's charity work or his philosophical evolution. I need that inheritance money, and I need you to help us get it back. The final blow came when Mr. Davies sent me a formal legal proposal that revealed the true scope of their strategy. If I agreed to sign a document stating that I believed the charity had manipulated Arthur during his final months, if I publicly declared that the will was the result of undue influence rather than his genuine wishes, they would graciously offer me a monthly stipend of $1,000 from the estate they planned to recover. The proposal was designed to buy my silence, make me complicit in destroying Arthur's reputation, and force me to betray everything I knew to be true about my husband's final act of generosity. It was a legal document that would have made me an active participant in stealing money from veterans who desperately needed help, all in exchange for what amounted to pocket change compared to the millions of dollars they were trying to claim. As I sat in my empty house that evening, reading and rereading the legal proposal that would have made me a traitor to everything Arthur had believed in, I felt something fundamental shift inside me. The woman who had spent decades fighting for ethical causes and protecting vulnerable people was not going to be destroyed by her own family's greed and manipulation. They had underestimated me, forgotten that I was the same person who had built successful nonprofit organizations from nothing, who had navigated complex financial and legal challenges for 38 years, who had once saved Arthur's career through sheer determination and strategic thinking. This time, I would use those same skills not to cover up the truth, but to expose it. The fight for Arthur's legacy was about to become a fight for my own soul. The final devastating blow to our family came with the cold efficiency of a legal document that transformed me from a grieving mother into a court-designated threat to my own children's safety. 6 weeks after Arthur's funeral, I received a certified letter from Mr. Davies that contained a temporary restraining order based on allegations that left me breathless with their calculated cruelty. Ruth Peterson is hereby restrained from coming within 500 feet of Mark Peterson, Lisa Chen, or their minor children. The document stated in the clinical language of legal proceedings. Based on credible evidence of harassment stalking behavior and increasing erratic conduct related to contested inheritance proceedings, the court finds that Mrs. Peterson poses a threat to the emotional and physical well-being of the petitioners. The fabricated claims detailed in the supporting documents painted a picture of a dangerous, mentally unstable woman who had been making threatening phone calls, showing up uninvited at family members' homes, and engaging in bizarre behavior that justified legal intervention. Every attempt I had made to reach out to my children, every plea for understanding, every expression of grief and confusion had been reframed as evidence of threatening conduct. Reading those lies, seeing my own maternal love weaponized against me in a court document felt like watching my entire identity being systematically destroyed by people who knew exactly which words would cause the most damage. I was no longer Ruth Peterson, respected community leader and loving mother. I was a legal threat, a person so dangerous that my own children needed court protection from my presence. The restraining order meant that I couldn't attend Emma's school play, couldn't pick up Samuel from soccer practice, couldn't even send birthday cards without risking arrest for violating a court order. My grandchildren, who had been the light of my life since the day they were born, were now legally protected from their own grandmother, as if I were a stranger who posed a danger to their safety. But I wasn't ready to accept this final banishment without making one last attempt to reach the hearts I knew still existed somewhere beneath the greed and manipulation that had consumed my family. Despite the legal risks, despite the humiliation of being treated like a criminal, I decided to create something that would remind them of who we used to be, of the love that had once defined our relationships. I spent an entire day going through photo albums and memory boxes, carefully selecting pictures that captured the best moments of our family life. Emma's first steps taken in my living room while Arthur and I cheered from the couch. Samuel's kindergarten graduation, where he had insisted on sitting between his grandparents during the ceremony. Christmas mornings, when Mark and Lisa were children themselves, their faces glowing with joy as they opened presents under a tree that Arthur and I had decorated together. I arranged these precious memories in a small album, adding handwritten notes that described what each moment had meant to me, how much joy their presence had brought to my life, how proud Arthur and I had been of the family we had built together. On the final page, I wrote a letter that came from the deepest part of my heart, a mother's plea to children who seemed to have forgotten that love existed beyond financial considerations. My dearest Mark and Lisa, I wrote my handwriting shaky with emotion. I know you're angry and hurt, and I understand that money feels more important than memories right now. But please remember that your father and I loved you more than any amount of money could ever represent. These pictures show who we really were as a family, before grief and fear made us forget how to see each other with love instead of suspicion. I drove to Mark's house after dark, my heart pounding with the knowledge that I was technically violating the restraining order, but desperate to make this final connection before all hope was lost. I left the album on his front porch with a small note asking him to please look through it and remember the people we used to be when love was stronger than greed. For 3 days, I waited for some sign that my gesture had touched something human in him, some indication that the son I had raised still existed somewhere beneath the angry stranger he had become. Instead, I discovered the fate of my precious memories through a social media post that destroyed whatever remained of my faith in his capacity for basic human decency. Brenda had posted a photograph of my carefully assembled album, visibly torn and cut into pieces, scattered across what appeared to be a garbage can. The caption she added was designed to inflict maximum psychological damage, cleaning out the clutter. Some people just can't let go of the past, moving forward from negativity and desperate attempts at emotional manipulation. The image of my children's faces, my grandchildren's smiles, and Arthur's loving expressions literally ripped apart and thrown away like trash was more devastating than any legal document or financial threat could have been. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about the complete destruction of every shared memory, every moment of love, every connection that had once made us a family. But the cruelest blow was still to come. The next morning, I received a text message from Mark that contained only 12 words, but those words ended our relationship as permanently as a death certificate. Consider this closed, Mom. Don't contact us again, ever. You're causing too much trouble. The casual dismissal in his tone, the reduction of 32 years of motherhood to too much trouble, felt like being erased from existence by someone who owed his very life to my love and sacrifice. I was no longer his mother. I was simply a problem that had been solved through legal intervention and emotional brutality. Lisa's betrayal took a different form, but was equally devastating. While Mark had chosen cruel directness, Lisa embarked on a campaign of subtle character assassination that spread through our community like a slow-acting poison. She called mutual friends, neighbors, and acquaintances with carefully crafted stories about my mental decline and obsession with controlling Arthur's money. "I'm really worried about Mom," she would say with practiced concern. "She's become fixated on this idea that Dad wanted to give away our inheritance, and she's making up elaborate stories about his secret charitable interests. We think she might be developing dementia, but she refuses to get help." Each conversation was designed to plant seeds of doubt about my competence while positioning Lisa as a caring daughter struggling with a difficult mother. The narrative was so skillfully constructed that even people who had known me for decades began treating me with the careful sympathy reserved for those whose minds could no longer be trusted. As I sat alone in my living room, legally banned from contact with my children and systematically isolated from my community, I found myself confronting the most painful secret of my entire marriage. The truth I was about to reveal to my retired probate judge, ally Eleanor Morrison, would explain not just Arthur's secret philanthropy, but the complex motivations that had driven his final act of generosity. "Eleanor," I said, during one of our private conversations, my voice barely above a whisper, "there's something about Arthur that I've never told anyone, something that makes his charitable giving more meaningful than my children could ever understand." I took a deep breath and forced myself to speak words I had never said aloud to acknowledge a reality I had spent decades helping to conceal. Arthur was not the man our community believed him to be. Throughout our marriage, he struggled with a profound sexual addiction that led to multiple affairs, secret relationships, and a double life that I discovered and helped him hide for over 20 years. The relief of finally speaking this truth was almost overwhelming, but the pain of what it represented about my marriage was equally devastating. I found evidence of his infidelity early in our marriage, but instead of confronting him or leaving him, I made a choice to protect his public image and our family's reputation. I became complicit in his deception, covering for his absences, managing the emotional fallout, and sacrificing my own happiness to maintain the facade of our perfect marriage. Eleanor listened with the compassion of someone who had spent decades hearing painful family secrets, but I could see the shock in her eyes as she realized the scope of what I had endured and concealed. For 20 years, I lived with the knowledge that my husband was betraying me while I publicly supported his career and defended his character. I helped him maintain relationships with women I knew he was sleeping with. I made excuses for his behavior to our children, to our friends, to myself. I sacrificed my emotional integrity and my personal truth to protect a man who was systematically destroying our marriage vows. The final, most painful revelation came as I explained how Arthur's secret will was connected to his lifetime of hidden guilt and my decades of silent sacrifice. In his final years, Arthur began to understand the cost of his choices, not just to me, but to his own sense of worth and purpose. His involvement with hope and healing wasn't just about helping veterans. It was about trying to atone for a lifetime of selfishness and deception. He never knew that I knew about his affairs, never realized that I had been protecting him from consequences he deserved to face. His secret will was his attempt to do something meaningful with money that he felt he had earned through lies and betrayal. And now, my children want to steal that money to prevent him from making the only honest, generous decision of his entire adult life. As I finished speaking, I felt the weight of 42 years of secrets and sacrifice settling around me like a heavy blanket. I had protected Arthur's reputation at the cost of my own emotional truth, had raised children who valued money more than integrity, had built a life on foundations of deception that were now crumbling beneath the weight of their own contradictions. But somewhere in the midst of this devastating revelation, I also felt a strange sense of liberation. The truth was finally spoken, the secrets were finally shared, and Margaret Peterson was ready to fight, not just for Arthur's legacy, but for her own right to live with honesty and dignity, regardless of the cost. The battle for my family's soul was about to begin, and this time, I would not sacrifice my truth to protect people who had chosen greed over love. The silence that followed my complete banishment from my family was unlike anything I had ever experienced in 70 years of life. It was not the peaceful quiet of solitude or the temporary stillness that comes with loss. It was the terrifying silence of being erased from existence by the people who owed their very lives to my love and sacrifice. Sitting alone in my empty house, legally forbidden from contacting my children and systematically cut off from my grandchildren, I found myself trapped in a psychological prison built from the very secrets I had spent decades protecting. The realization that my entire marriage had been built on lies I had helped perpetuate now served as the foundation of my undoing, turning every memory into a source of torment. The weight of Arthur's sexual addiction, the knowledge of his decades of betrayal, the sacrifices I had made to protect a man who had never truly loved me. The way I deserved all of it crashed down on me with crushing force. I had given up my integrity, my financial security, my emotional truth to preserve a marriage that was fundamentally fraudulent, and now that sacrifice was being used as evidence of my own supposed mental instability. Every morning, I woke up to the sound of my own breathing in a house that felt more like a mausoleum than a home. The photographs on the walls mocked me with their images of family happiness that I now knew had been as carefully staged as any theatrical performance. The wedding pictures showed a young woman who had no idea she was marrying a man who would systematically betray her trust for 42 years. But the psychological torment was only the beginning of a systematic campaign designed to destroy not just my family relationships, but my entire identity and reputation in the community where I had spent decades building a life of ethical leadership and meaningful service. Brenda's assault on my professional standing was particularly devastating because it targeted the one area where I had always felt competent and valued. Using her connections in social media and her talent for spreading damaging rumors, she began contacting former colleagues and board members from the nonprofit organizations where I had served with distinction for nearly 4 decades. I'm really concerned about Ruth's mental state. She would tell people with practiced sympathy. She's been making some very strange financial decisions lately, and we're worried that she might be developing dementia or some other cognitive condition that's affecting her judgment about money. The implication was subtle but devastating if I couldn't be trusted to understand my own husband's will. How could anyone trust my past decisions about managing charitable funds or serving on boards that oversaw millions of dollars in donations? Each conversation planted seeds of doubt about my competence while positioning Brenda as a caring family member trying to protect both me and the organizations I had served. Within weeks, I began receiving polite but firm letters from boards where I had served as a member or advisor. Due to recent concerns about potential conflicts of interest and capacity issues, one letter read, "We feel it would be best if you step back from your role while you focus on resolving your family situation. The humiliation of being quietly removed from positions I had held with honor for decades was compounded by the knowledge that these decisions were based on lies and manipulation rather than any actual evidence of incompetence. My life's work, my professional legacy, my reputation for ethical leadership, all of it was being systematically destroyed by a woman who had never contributed anything meaningful to our community beyond gossip and social climbing. The financial pressure that accompanied this professional assassination was swift and devastating. The legal fees from defending myself against the will contest and the restraining order quickly consumed my savings, while the frozen bank accounts that Mark had arranged for my protection made it impossible for me to access money that was legally mine. We're concerned about some suspicious financial activity on your accounts, the bank manager explained when I tried to withdraw money for basic living expenses. Your son has filed a report suggesting that you might be vulnerable to financial exploitation, so we've temporarily frozen your accounts until this situation can be resolved. The cruel irony was breathtaking. The people who were actually exploiting me financially had convinced the bank that they were protecting me from exploitation. Every attempt I made to access my own money was met with bureaucratic obstacles that had been deliberately created by my own children to ensure my financial ruin. The mounting legal bills and lack of access to my funds led to the unthinkable foreclosure proceedings on the home where Arthur and I had raised our children, where we had celebrated holidays and anniversaries, where every room held memories of a life I was now forced to question. The house that had been my sanctuary became just another asset to be liquidated to pay for lawyers who were defending me against my own family's lies. The day of the eviction was deliberately scheduled to coincide with a local news story about housing insecurity among elderly residents, ensuring that my personal humiliation would be broadcast to the entire community. I stood on the sidewalk where I had once watched my children learn to ride bicycles, watching as strangers loaded my possessions into trucks bound for public auction. The neighbors who had known me for decades watched from their windows with a mixture of pity and suspicion, having been told that my situation was the result of my own poor judgment and declining mental capacity. I was no longer Ruth Peterson respected community leader. I was a cautionary tale about elderly people who couldn't manage their own affairs. But perhaps the cruelest blow came through what was supposedly a charity event designed to honor family values and community service. Mark and Brenda had arranged for Emma and Samuel to participate in a public relations campaign for a family values organization using my grandchildren as unwitting weapons in their war against my credibility. The local newspaper featured a story about the event, including photos of Emma holding up a drawing she had made of a happy family that conspicuously excluded any mention or image of me. Samuel, now 15 and old enough to understand the implications of his words, gave a rehearsed speech about uncovering hidden truths about family that was clearly designed to imply that I had been dishonest about our family's values and relationships. Sometimes people we love aren't who we thought they were, Samuel said to a room full of adults who nodded approvingly at his apparent wisdom. It's important to stand up for what's right, even when it means standing up to family members who aren't telling the truth. Watching my grandson, the boy who used to beg me to read him bedtime stories, publicly denounce me as a liar in front of community leaders and media representatives was like watching my own heart being torn out and displayed for public entertainment. These children, who had once seen me as their source of comfort and wisdom, had been thoroughly indoctrinated to view me as a threat to their family's well-being. But in my darkest moment, when I was living in a homeless shelter and contemplating whether life was worth continuing, an unexpected lifeline appeared in the form of Eleanor Martinez, the director of Hope and Healing, the charity that Arthur had chosen to receive the bulk of his estate. "Mrs. Peterson," she said when she found me at the shelter, "I've been following the public attacks against you, and I want you to know that everything I've learned about your husband suggests that you are exactly the kind of person he would have trusted with his final wishes." Eleanor had done her own investigation into Arthur's background and our family situation, and what she discovered convinced her that I was telling the truth about his intentions and his character. More importantly, she had connections to pro bono attorneys who specialized in elder fraud and defamation cases, lawyers who were willing to fight for justice even when their clients couldn't pay their fees. Hope and Healing has been the recipient of your husband's generosity for 3 years, she explained. His donations helped us expand our programs for veterans with PTSD, and his personal involvement in our work was genuine and deeply committed. What your family is trying to do isn't just theft. It's an attack on vulnerable veterans who desperately need the help your husband wanted to provide. For the first time in months, I felt something other than despair and isolation. Someone believed me. Someone understood what Arthur had really wanted, and someone was willing to fight alongside me to ensure that his final act of generosity wouldn't be destroyed by greed and manipulation. As I lay in my narrow shelter bed that night, listening to the sounds of other displaced women around me, I felt a spark of the fierce determination that had once made me a successful nonprofit leader. Ruth Peterson was not finished fighting, and with Eleanor's help, I was about to discover weapons I didn't even know I possessed. The ultimate insult came in the form of a glittering charity gala that Mark and Brenda orchestrated 6 months after Arthur's death, an event designed to rewrite history while basking in the glow of fraudulent philanthropy and community admiration. The Arthur Peterson Memorial Foundation Gala was announced with great fanfare in our local society pages, presented as a loving tribute to a man whose true legacy was being honored by his devoted family. Reading about the event in a newspaper I found at the homeless shelter, I felt physically sick as I realized the scope of their deception. They had created an entirely fabricated charitable foundation using Arthur's name and reputation, deliberately positioned as the appropriate way to honor his memory, in contrast to what they called the questionable Hope and Healing charity that had supposedly taken advantage of his declining mental state. The invitation list included every prominent figure in our community: politicians, business leaders, society, matrons, and philanthropists who had known and respected Arthur during his lifetime. The venue was the most prestigious hotel in our city, and the guest list promised an evening of elegance and community service that would cement Mark and Brenda's position as worthy inheritors of Arthur's social standing. But what made the event particularly devastating was its deliberate design to exclude and discredit everything Arthur had actually cared about during his final years. The Arthur Peterson Memorial Foundation, according to their promotional materials, would focus on traditional family values and supporting local families in need, causes that sounded noble but bore no resemblance to the veterans' mental health programs that had actually captured Arthur's heart and commitment. The gala's program included a detailed timeline of Arthur's philanthropic journey that conveniently omitted any mention of hope and healing, while highlighting his early socially acceptable charitable activities. They had literally erased 3 years of his most meaningful work, replacing it with a sanitized version of his legacy that served their narrative of his supposed manipulation by opportunistic organizations. Eleanor Martinez, the director of Hope and Healing, called me at the shelter to let me know about the gala and to ask if I wanted to watch the live stream that the event organizers were providing. Against my better judgment, I found myself at the public library that evening, hunched over a computer screen in a corner where other homeless people and struggling families came to access the internet they couldn't afford at home. Watching Mark take the stage in his expensive tuxedo, standing before an audience of hundreds of well-dressed community leaders, I felt like I was witnessing the funeral of my husband's true character. The man speaking bore no resemblance to the son I had raised, and the Arthur he described bore no resemblance to the husband who had spent his final years trying to atone for a lifetime of selfish choices. My father was a man who always put family first, Mark said, with the polished delivery of someone who had rehearsed these lies until they sounded natural. His greatest joy came from knowing that his children and grandchildren would be secure and successful, that the values he instilled in us would be passed down to future generations. The audience nodded approvingly as Mark painted a picture of Arthur as a traditional family patriarch whose primary concern was building generational wealth and preserving conservative social values. Every word was carefully chosen to imply that any charitable giving outside the family sphere was suspect, that Arthur's true intentions had always been focused on his immediate descendants rather than broader humanitarian concerns. Brenda's interview with the local news station was even more insidious in its implications. Speaking with the practiced sympathy of someone who had perfected the art of appearing reasonable while spreading poison, she described the challenges of protecting Arthur's true legacy from opportunistic organizations that had allegedly taken advantage of his difficult final months. It's heartbreaking to see how some charities prey on elderly people who are vulnerable and isolated. She said with tears in her eyes that I knew were as fake as everything else about her performance. Arthur was such a generous man, and unfortunately, that generosity was exploited by people who didn't really understand his values or his priorities. The camera captured sympathetic nods from other gala attendees as Brenda described the difficult decision to contest the will and the painful process of discovering that Arthur had been influenced to make charitable commitments that didn't reflect his true wishes. She made it sound like they were the victims protecting a beloved patriarch's reputation from posthumous exploitation. But the most devastating part of the evening was watching Emma and Samuel, my precious grandchildren, being paraded before the cameras as evidence of the family's moral authority and Arthur's real legacy. At 13 and 15, they were old enough to understand the implications of their participation, but still young enough to be thoroughly manipulated by parents who had convinced them that they were honoring their grandfather's memory. Emma, wearing a beautiful dress that had probably cost more than I spent on food in a month, spoke to a reporter about our family's commitment to helping people in our community. Her words were clearly rehearsed, but her delivery was natural enough to be convincing to anyone who didn't know the truth about what our family had become. Samuel's contribution was even more painful to watch. He had prepared a brief speech about learning from Grandpa's example and understanding what really matters in life. Themes that sounded admirable until you realized that he was unknowingly helping to destroy the very charitable work that Arthur had actually valued during his final years. Grandpa taught us that family comes first, Samuel said with the earnest conviction of a teenager who believed he was speaking truth. He showed us that taking care of the people you love is more important than anything else, and that's what we're trying to do by honoring his real wishes instead of letting strangers change his legacy. The cruel irony was that Samuel was perfectly sincere in his desire to honor his grandfather's memory, but he had been so thoroughly indoctrinated with lies about Arthur's character and intentions that his sincere tribute became another weapon in the war against truth and justice. The evening's program also featured Mr. Davies, their aggressive lawyer, speaking at a seminar on estate planning ethics that was designed to lend academic credibility to their attack on hope and healing. His presentation, titled "Protecting Vulnerable Seniors from Undue Influence," was a masterclass in using legitimate concerns about elder abuse to justify their own exploitation of exactly that kind of vulnerability. We see far too many cases where well-meaning charitable organizations cross ethical boundaries in their eagerness to secure major donations. Davies told an audience of estate planning attorneys and financial advisors. It's crucial that family members remain vigilant about protecting their loved ones from sophisticated manipulation, even when that manipulation comes from organizations with admirable stated goals. His implications were clear to anyone who had been following our family's legal battle. Hope and Healing was exactly the kind of sophisticated organization that had manipulated Arthur, and Mark and Brenda were exactly the kind of vigilant family members who deserved praise for protecting their father's true interests. But as I sat in that library, tears streaming down my face as I watched my husband's memory being systematically destroyed for public consumption, I received an unexpected message that gave me the first glimmer of hope I had felt in months. Dr. Patricia Williams, a former board member from one of the nonprofit organizations where I had served for 15 years, had been watching the gala coverage with growing disgust. Having worked closely with me on major fundraising campaigns and strategic planning initiatives, she knew the difference between a legitimate philanthropist and a social climber seeking public admiration. Ruth, her email said, "I've been watching this travesty unfold, and I want you to know that some of us remember who you really are and what you actually accomplished during your career. I have documentation of Arthur's growing interest in veterans' issues over the past several years, including conversations he had with me about expanding our organization's mental health programs." Patricia's message included an offer to provide formal testimony about Arthur's authentic charitable interests and his explicit discussions about supporting veterans with PTSD. More importantly, she had maintained detailed records of our organization's board meetings and strategic planning sessions that would prove Arthur's legitimate and sustained commitment to exactly the kind of work that Hope and Healing was doing. For the first time since this nightmare began, I had an ally with both credibility and documentation, someone whose professional reputation was unassailable and whose testimony could counter the carefully constructed lies that Mark and Brenda had been spreading. The battle for Arthur's true legacy was far from over, but I was no longer fighting it alone. As I logged off the library computer that night, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months, righteous anger mixed with genuine hope. Ruth Peterson, the woman who had spent 38 years fighting for justice and protecting vulnerable people, was about to remind everyone exactly what she was capable of when the cause was right and the evidence was on her side. The final assault on my dignity and survival came with the brutal efficiency of a military campaign designed to leave no possibility of resistance or recovery. Mark and Brenda, emboldened by their successful public relations campaign and confident that they had destroyed my credibility beyond repair, launched a coordinated attack that would strip away the last vestiges of my financial security and physical safety. The lawsuit arrived by certified mail on a Tuesday morning at the homeless shelter where I had been staying for 3 weeks. Mark was suing me for $750,000 in damages, claiming that my harassment and defamatory statements about the family and Arthur's will had caused him severe emotional distress and damaged his reputation in the community. The legal document was a masterpiece of calculated cruelty, detailing every attempt I had made to contact my children, every plea for understanding every expression of grief and confusion as evidence of a systematic campaign of harassment designed to manipulate them into abandoning their legitimate inheritance claims. My maternal love had been reframed as stalking behavior, my grief portrayed as mental instability, my desperate attempts to preserve Arthur's memory transformed into malicious attacks on his character. But the lawsuit was only the opening salvo in a coordinated campaign that revealed the true scope of their planning and preparation. While I was struggling to find legal representation I could afford, Mark was contacting every organization where I had ever worked, every pension fund I was entitled to receive, every professional association that had recognized my service over the years. I'm calling out of concern for my mother's mental health and financial competence, he told administrators, with the practiced sincerity of someone who had perfected the art of appearing reasonable while committing emotional violence. She's been exhibiting signs of severe cognitive decline and making increasingly erratic financial decisions. I'm worried that she may have engaged in misconduct during her professional career that we're only now discovering. The implications of his concerns were devastating and far-reaching. If I was mentally incompetent, now how could anyone be certain that my past decisions had been sound? If I was capable of the harassment and manipulation he was alleging, what other unethical behavior might I have engaged in during decades of managing charitable funds and serving on boards that oversaw millions of dollars in donations? Within weeks, I received formal notifications that my nonprofit pension had been suspended pending an investigation into allegations of financial misconduct. Professional honors I had received for ethical leadership and community service were quietly revoked. My name was removed from donor recognition walls and memorial plaques that had celebrated my contributions to organizations I had helped build from nothing. The psychological impact of watching my life's work being systematically erased was almost more devastating than the financial consequences. I had spent 38 years building a reputation for integrity and competence, and in a matter of weeks, Mark and Brenda had convinced institutional administrators that I was not only mentally incompetent, but potentially corrupt. The mounting legal fees from defending against Mark's lawsuit, combined with the loss of my pension and the ongoing inability to access my frozen bank accounts, made it impossible to maintain even the modest accommodations I had found after losing my home. The stress and malnutrition had already taken a visible toll on my health, and the constant anxiety about my financial survival was pushing my body beyond its limits. The final eviction notice came with a media alert that Brenda had carefully orchestrated to ensure maximum public humiliation. Local news crews were positioned outside the low-rent apartment building. When the sheriff's deputies arrived to escort me to the sidewalk, my few remaining possessions loaded into garbage bags that were tossed unceremoniously onto the curb. Elderly woman faces homelessness after family dispute, read the headline in the evening news, but the story that followed painted me as a confused old woman whose poor judgment and stubborn refusal to accept help from her caring children had led to her current predicament. The narrative was carefully crafted to generate sympathy for Mark and Lisa, while portraying me as a cautionary tale about the dangers of elderly independence and family conflict. Standing on that sidewalk, holding garbage bags that contained the remnants of a life that had once included respect, security, and purpose, I felt the full weight of my complete powerlessness against people who had no limits to their cruelty and no conscience about the human cost of their greed. But perhaps the most devastating blow was still to come. Mark and Lisa, now confident that they had successfully destroyed my ability to challenge them, maintained an attitude of cold indifference that was more hurtful than active cruelty could have been. When reporters asked Mark about his mother's situation, he responded with the practiced sympathy of someone discussing a stranger's misfortune. My mother is dealing with some serious mental health issues that have affected her judgment about money and relationships, he said with the tone of someone who had been pushed beyond his emotional limits by a difficult situation. We've tried to help her, but she's refused assistance and made accusations against family members that we simply can't enable or support. Lisa's response was even more calculated in its dismissal. She posted on social media about her busy schedule and her family's need to focus on positive relationships, subtle implications that I was a source of drama and negativity that they had wisely chosen to avoid. The complete absence of any recognition that I was a human being in crisis, that I was their mother facing homelessness and destitution, that I was a 70-year-old woman who had devoted her entire life to caring for them and their children was more devastating than any act of abuse could have been. But Brenda's final insult surpassed even her previous cruelties in its calculated symbolism and public mockery, using money that should have gone to hope and healing money that Arthur had specifically designated to help veterans with PTSD. She purchased a $30,000 luxury car that she then publicly dedicated to Mark as a tribute to his financial wisdom and strong family leadership. The photos she posted on social media showed her and Mark posing proudly beside their new vehicle, with captions celebrating his success in protecting the family's financial interests and securing their children's future. The car was parked in the driveway of the house they had purchased, with money stolen from veterans, a gleaming symbol of their victory over both Arthur's charitable intentions and my attempts to honor his true wishes. So proud of my husband's strength and wisdom during this difficult time, Brenda wrote in a post that was shared hundreds of times by people who admired their apparent triumph over family adversity. Real leadership means making hard decisions and protecting the people you love, even when others don't understand or appreciate your sacrifice. The image of them celebrating their theft with Arthur's money, transforming his charitable legacy into a trophy of their deceit, was the final straw that broke whatever remained of my spirit. The stress and malnutrition, the constant anxiety and humiliation, the complete abandonment by everyone I had ever loved, all of it culminated in a physical collapse that left me unconscious on the floor of the homeless shelter. The heart attack that followed was severe enough to require emergency surgery, and as I lay in the hospital's charity ward, my life hanging by a thread, I experienced a vivid, dreamlike memory that would change everything I thought I knew about Arthur's relationship with our children. In my semi-conscious state, I recalled a conversation from years earlier when Arthur had confided in me about Mark's gambling problem and the $50,000 debt he had secretly accumulated at various casinos. Arthur had used his personal savings money that should have been part of our retirement security to quietly pay off Mark's creditors and prevent the scandal that would have destroyed Mark's marriage and career. "I can't let him face the consequences of his choices," Arthur had said, with the exhausted resignation of a parent who had enabled bad behavior for too long. "But I also can't let him know that I'm bailing him out again. He needs to believe he solved this problem himself, or he'll never learn to make better decisions." That memory, retrieved from the depths of my unconscious mind as my body fought for survival, revealed the final, most bitter irony of our entire family tragedy. Arthur had been secretly sacrificing for Mark's welfare, even as Mark was plotting to steal money that Arthur had designated for people who truly needed help. As I drifted between consciousness and oblivion in that hospital bed, I felt something ignite inside me that was stronger than despair, more powerful than exhaustion, more enduring than the cruelty that had nearly destroyed me. Ruth Peterson had work to finish, and neither her family's greed nor her own physical limitations were going to stop her from ensuring that the truth finally emerged. Recovery from my heart attack was slow and painful, but it was during those long hours in the charity ward of the hospital that I made a decision that would either save my life or provide the final evidence of my supposed mental incompetence. I was going to create a video testimony that would tell the complete truth about Arthur's intentions about Mark and Brenda's systematic fraud, and about the deeper patterns of sacrifice and betrayal that had defined our family for decades. The kind nurse who had been caring for me, Maria Santos, listened with growing concern as I explained what I needed to do. She had seen enough family conflicts during her 20 years in healthcare to recognize the difference between legitimate mental decline and systematic emotional abuse, and what she observed about my situation convinced her that I was the victim rather than the perpetrator of the cruelty being described in my medical chart. "Mrs. Peterson," she said quietly, glancing around to make sure we weren't being observed, "I've been watching how your family treats you during visiting hours, and I've been reading the things they're saying about you in the media. Something about this situation doesn't feel right to me." With Maria's help, I used her personal phone to create a raw, unedited video message that contained everything I had been prevented from saying during months of systematic silencing. Propped up in my hospital bed, connected to monitors that tracked my fragile vital signs, I spoke directly into the camera with the clarity and conviction of someone who had nothing left to lose. "My name is Ruth Peterson, and I am 70 years old. I began my voice weak but steady. I am making this recording from my hospital bed because I may not have another opportunity to tell the truth about what my son Mark and his wife Brenda have done to me, to my husband's memory, and to the veterans who desperately need the help that Arthur wanted to provide." I detailed everything: Mark's ruthless greed, Brenda's calculated manipulation, the systematic campaign to destroy my credibility and steal money that belonged to hope and healing. Most importantly, I played the audio recordings from my home security system that captured Arthur's final conversations with his lawyer, conversations that explicitly detailed his true intentions for the secret will and his profound disappointment in our children's materialism. "This is my husband's actual voice," I said, as Arthur's recorded words filled the small hospital room. "Listen to him explain why he chose to support veterans with PTSD instead of enabling our children's sense of entitlement. Listen to him describe his deep sadness about Mark and Lisa's obsession with money instead of meaning. Listen to him express his hope that his charitable giving might teach them something about service and sacrifice." The recordings were devastating in their clarity and authenticity. Arthur's voice discussing his growing disillusionment with Mark and Brenda's lifestyle, his concern about the values he was passing down to his grandchildren, his determination to use his money for something more meaningful than supporting their expensive habits, provided undeniable evidence of his true state of mind and genuine intentions. But perhaps most powerfully, I revealed the painful memory I had recovered during my collapse, Arthur's secret financial sacrifice for Mark's gambling debts. Mark is fighting to steal money from veterans while sitting in a car that was purchased with money his father secretly spent to cover his gambling losses. I said, my voice breaking with emotion. Arthur sacrificed our retirement security to protect Mark from the consequences of his choices, and this is how Mark chooses to repay that sacrifice. Maria helped me send the video to Mark's email address using an encrypted service that would ensure the message reached him directly before anyone else could interfere. We waited 3 days for some response, some sign that the son I had raised still existed somewhere beneath the greedy stranger he had become. Instead, I learned about the fate of my desperate plea through a national news program that Maria showed me on the hospital television. Brenda had somehow intercepted the video before Mark could see it, and what she did with my raw, heartfelt testimony was a masterpiece of digital manipulation that transformed my truth into evidence of my supposed delusions. Using sophisticated editing software, Brenda had altered the audio levels to make my voice sound weak and confused, had spliced sentences together out of context to create statements I had never made, and had added ominous background music that made my desperate plea sound like the ramblings of a paranoid, mentally unstable woman. Most devastatingly, she had edited out the actual audio recordings of Arthur's conversations with his lawyer, replacing them with her own narration that described them as fabricated evidence created by a dying woman trying to manipulate her family and defame her deceased husband's memory. The doctored video was sold to Justice Tonight, a national gossip program that specialized in sensationalizing family conflicts and legal disputes. The show's host, a former prosecutor who had been disbarred for his own ethical violations, presented my testimony as a tragic example of how mental illness could destroy even the most accomplished people. "What you're about to see is heartbreaking," he announced to his national audience. Ruth Peterson, once a respected community leader, has been reduced to making wild accusations against her own family from her hospital bed. Mental health experts tell us that elderly individuals experiencing cognitive decline often develop elaborate conspiracy theories about family members, and Mrs. Peterson's video is a textbook example of this tragic phenomenon. They played carefully selected excerpts from my video, focusing on moments where my voice broke with emotion and skipping over the specific evidence I had presented. My desperate appeal to Mark's conscience was edited to sound like the manipulation of a dying woman trying to retain control over family members who had rightfully moved on with their lives. The show brought in a psychiatrist who had never examined me, but was willing to offer a professional opinion based on the edited footage. What we're seeing here is consistent with paranoid dementia, he explained with the authority of someone providing expert medical testimony. The patient creates an elaborate narrative that casts family members as villains while portraying herself as the victim of a complex conspiracy. But the most devastating moment came when Mark agreed to appear on the program for what was billed as an exclusive interview about the challenges of caring for a parent with severe mental illness. Sitting in the studio with perfect lighting and professional makeup, he looked every inch the concerned son, bearing an unbearable burden with grace and dignity. This video broke my heart. Mark said his voice perfectly calibrated to convey pain and exhaustion. To see someone I love and respect reduced to these kinds of desperate accusations, it's devastating. My mother was brilliant, truly one of the finest nonprofit leaders of her generation. But the woman in that video isn't the mother who raised me. The host leaned forward with practiced sympathy. How long has she been experiencing these symptoms? Mark paused, as if gathering the strength to speak about something almost too painful to discuss. The decline has been gradual, but unmistakable, he said. It started with small things, forgetting details about her work, becoming confused about family relationships. But after my father's death, her condition deteriorated rapidly. She became fixated on this idea that he had secret charitable interests that none of us knew about. And now she's making these serious accusations against you and your family. Mark's eyes filled with carefully manufactured tears. The hardest part is knowing that somewhere inside that confusion and paranoia is the woman who taught me everything I know about integrity and service. She would be horrified to know that her illness is causing her to attack the very principles she spent her life defending. Emma appeared via video link from what appeared to be her bedroom, looking genuinely distressed as she had been coached to appear. "I just want my grandmother to be at peace," she said, her teenage voice breaking with what seemed like authentic emotion. She's fighting battles that don't exist, seeing enemies where there are only people who love her and want to help. The program concluded with information about resources for families dealing with elderly relatives experiencing paranoid dementia, and Mark and Brenda were praised for their courage in speaking publicly about such a private family tragedy. Several legal commentators noted how difficult it must be to honor a parent's true wishes while protecting the community from the harmful effects of their mental decline. As the program ended and Maria turned off the television, I lay in my hospital bed, feeling a complex mixture of devastation and strange relief. They had taken my voice and twisted it into a weapon against me, had transformed my most desperate plea for truth into evidence of my own supposed insanity, had made my love for my family into proof of my mental incompetence. But they had also revealed something crucial about themselves, their absolute commitment to destroying any evidence that contradicted their narrative, their willingness to use the most sophisticated tools of deception and manipulation to maintain their theft, their complete absence of any human compassion for a 70-year-old woman fighting for her life and her integrity. More importantly, Patricia Williams, my former colleague, who had witnessed the entire media circus, was now more convinced than ever that she was watching a systematic campaign of elder abuse disguised as family concern. Her email to my pro bono legal team was brief but devastating. "I have 30 years of documentation proving that Ruth Peterson is one of the most ethical and competent people I've ever worked with. What's being done to her is criminal, and I'm prepared to testify to that truth in any court in the country." As I drifted off to sleep that night, sustained by medications that kept my damaged heart beating, and by a hope that refused to die, despite everything they had done to destroy it, I knew that Ruth Peterson's story was far from over. The truth had been silenced, but it had not been destroyed, and there were still people in the world who recognized the difference between justice and cruelty, between legitimate concern and systematic abuse. The final battle for my dignity and Arthur's legacy was about to begin, and this time I would not be fighting it alone. The turning point came when Patricia Williams, my former colleague and one of the most respected figures in our state's philanthropic community, made a discovery that would change everything. While going through her own files to prepare testimony for my case, she found documentation of a small legal settlement I had completely forgotten about during the chaos of my family's betrayal. 20 years earlier, I had consulted on a major fraud case involving a corrupt charity, and the settlement from that work had been sitting in an escrow account, earning interest and growing to nearly $200,000. Patricia's legal team helped me access these forgotten funds, providing me with the resources to hire the kind of representation that Mark and Brenda had never expected me to be able to afford. Eleanor Morrison, the retired probate judge who had become my closest ally, recommended a legal team that specialized in complex elder fraud cases. The lead attorney, David Chen, had built his career on exposing financial exploitation disguised as family concern, and when he reviewed the evidence I had collected, his expression grew grim with the recognition of systematic abuse. "Mrs. Peterson," he told me during our first meeting, "what your family has done to you isn't just theft. It's a carefully orchestrated campaign of psychological warfare designed to destroy your credibility while stealing money designated for people who desperately need help." The federal lawsuit we filed sent shockwaves through both the legal community and the media. The charges included elder abuse conspiracy to defraud, criminal defamation, and violation of federal laws governing charitable giving. But more importantly, the case attracted the attention of investigative journalists who recognized the broader implications of families using legal and psychological manipulation to override their relatives' charitable intentions. The trial began 8 months after I had nearly died in that hospital bed, and I sat in the plaintiff's chair, feeling like I was finally going to have my voice heard by people with the power to deliver justice. The courtroom was packed with reporters, legal professionals, and advocates for elder rights who understood that this case could set precedents for protecting elderly people from exactly the kind of exploitation I had endured. The climax came when David Chen presented the complete unedited audio recordings from Arthur's home study, captured by the security system that Mark and Brenda had never known existed. The courtroom fell silent as Arthur's voice filled the space, speaking with the clarity and conviction of a man who knew exactly what he wanted to accomplish with his final act of generosity. "I've been giving serious thought to our family's values and priorities," Arthur's recorded voice said during one of his conversations with the Hope and Healing attorney. "Mark has accumulated over $100,000 in personal debt through poor financial decisions, and Lisa owes $50,000 on credit cards for lifestyle expenses they can't afford. I'm tired of enabling their sense of entitlement to money they haven't earned." The recording continued with devastating clarity as Arthur explained his growing disillusionment with our children's materialism. "They see my success as their inheritance rather than understanding it as a responsibility to help others. The veterans who suffer from PTSD have sacrificed more for our freedom than my children have ever sacrificed for anything. It's time for my money to go where it can do real good instead of funding more luxury purchases and poor choices." But perhaps the most damning evidence came when Arthur's voice revealed his knowledge of past sacrifices he had made for Mark's sake. "I've already spent $50,000 covering Mark's gambling debts without his knowledge," Arthur said with profound sadness. "I hoped that protecting him from consequences would teach him to make better decisions. But instead, it seems to have convinced him that money will always appear when he needs it." The impact of hearing Arthur's actual words, his genuine disappointment in his children's values, his authentic commitment to helping veterans was devastating to Mark and Brenda's carefully constructed narrative. There was no ambiguity, no room for interpretation, No possibility that he had been manipulated or coerced. This was a man making deliberate, well-reasoned decisions about his own money based on his own values. When Mark was called to testify, the transformation was heartbreaking to witness. The confident, manipulative man who had orchestrated my destruction was replaced by someone who looked like he was crumbling from the inside out. Confronted with his father's recorded words, with the undeniable evidence of his own greed and cruelty, Mark's carefully maintained facade finally shattered completely. "Mr. Peterson," David Chen said calmly, "are you prepared to tell this court that your father did not mean what he said in these recordings?" Mark opened his mouth, but no words came out. His face crumpled as the weight of his father's disappointment, the evidence of his own financial irresponsibility, and the magnitude of the suffering he had caused me all crashed down on him simultaneously. "I never meant for it to go this far," he whispered, then began sobbing uncontrollably. "I just needed the money so badly, and Brenda said Mom would never really fight us, and I thought Dad would understand if he knew how much debt we had." His voice rose to a near scream as months of suppressed guilt finally erupted. But he was right about everything. We are selfish. We are entitled. We don't deserve the money he wanted to give to people who actually served their country and suffered for it. The sight of my son's complete psychological breakdown was devastating, even knowing everything he had done to me. This was the little boy I had raised, the young man whose wedding I had planned, the father of my grandchildren. Watching him destroy himself with his own confession was like watching a part of my heart die in public. Brenda attempted to maintain her composure, but when the evidence of her role as the primary architect of the conspiracy was presented, her cunning facade collapsed into desperate tears and frantic denials. She tried to flee the courtroom when she realized that her carefully constructed web of lies was unraveling, but court officers apprehended her before she reached the door. Mr. Davies, the aggressive lawyer who had threatened and intimidated me for months, sat in stunned silence as his own disbarment proceedings were announced. The man who had built his reputation on aggressive legal tactics was about to lose everything because he had chosen to participate in systematic elder abuse rather than ethical advocacy. But perhaps the most poignant moment came when Lisa, who had been present throughout the trial, finally heard the complete truth about what our family had become. As Arthur's voice filled the courtroom with his profound disappointment in his children's values, as the evidence of Mark and Brenda's cruelty was laid bare, Lisa broke down in silent tears. She looked across the courtroom at me with eyes filled with shame and desperate remorse, but she didn't approach. She understood that the chasm created by months of her passive complicity and harsh words couldn't be bridged with a simple gesture that redemption would require much more than tears and belated recognition of the truth. As the judge gavelled the session closed that day, I felt a complex mixture of vindication and profound sadness. Justice was being served, the truth was finally being heard, but the cost had been the complete destruction of my family relationships and the public exposure of just how far greed could drive people to betray those they claimed to love. Yet underneath the pain, there was something else, a profound sense of relief that Arthur's voice had finally been heard, that his genuine intentions for helping veterans would be honored, and that Ruth Peterson was no longer a silenced victim, but a woman whose truth had been validated by people with the power to enforce justice. The court's verdict came down with the force of absolute moral authority delivered by Judge Catherine Morrison, a woman whose 40-year career had been built on protecting vulnerable people from exactly the kind of exploitation I had endured. Her words carried the weight of legal precedent and ethical clarity that would resonate far beyond our individual case. In my 4 decades on the bench, Judge Morrison began her voice carrying the gravity of someone who had seen every form of human cruelty and redemption. I have rarely encountered such a systematic campaign of elder abuse disguised as family concern. The defendant's actions represent not merely criminal behavior, but a profound violation of the trust that forms the foundation of both family relationships and charitable giving. Mark received a sentence of 10 years in federal prison, while Brenda was sentenced to 7 years. The financial restitution ordered by the court exceeded $800,000, covering not only my legal fees and medical expenses, but also punitive damages for the systematic psychological abuse they had inflicted. Mr. Davies faced his own criminal charges and immediate disbarment, his 30-year legal career ending in disgrace. But more important than the punishment was the court's explicit validation of Arthur's charitable intentions and my role in protecting them. Judge Morrison's written statement became part of the permanent legal record, a document that would influence elder abuse cases for decades to come. Arthur Peterson's final will represents a thoughtful, well-reasoned decision by a competent adult to use his resources for humanitarian purposes, the judge wrote. Ruth Peterson's courageous fight to honor her husband's true wishes despite systematic attacks on her character and financial security exemplifies the kind of integrity our legal system is designed to protect and reward. The immediate result was the court-ordered transfer of $2.4 million to Hope and Healing, the charity that Arthur had chosen to receive the bulk of his estate. Eleanor Martinez, the charity's director, issued a public statement that brought me to tears with its recognition of both Arthur's generosity and my sacrifice to honor his intentions. Arthur Peterson's gift will fund mental health programs for veterans for the next decade, Eleanor announced at a press conference. But it's Ruth Peterson's courage in fighting for this donation, despite unimaginable personal cost, that truly honors the spirit of service that makes this charity possible. The media coverage of the verdict was extensive and largely sympathetic to my situation, with legal experts praising the case as a landmark victory for elder rights and ethical estate planning. Several news outlets featured my story as an example of how systematic family abuse could be disguised as concern for an elderly relative's welfare. But the personal aftermath of the trial was complex and emotionally devastating in ways that legal victory couldn't address. The letter I received from Mark 3 weeks after he began serving his sentence was written in handwriting I barely recognized, shaky and uncertain, the script of a broken man grappling with the consequences of choices that had destroyed his life and his family. Dear Mom, he wrote, I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness, no right to expect anything from you after what I've done. Sitting in this cell, I've had time to think about everything that led to this moment, and I can't escape the truth of what I became. His letter went on for pages, detailing his growing recognition of how Brenda had encouraged his worst instincts while convincing him that stealing from veterans was somehow justified by his financial needs. But what struck me most was his acknowledgement of the deeper patterns of entitlement and selfishness that had shaped his adult life. I know now that you sacrificed so much for Lisa and me over the years, things we never knew about or appreciated, he continued. Dad was right about our sense of entitlement, about our inability to understand that money should be earned through service rather than inherited through birth. I don't know how to live with the knowledge of what I've done to you, but I want you to know that I'm trying to become someone worthy of the mother who raised me. Reading his words filled me with a complex mixture of sorrow and hope. The son who had destroyed my reputation and nearly killed me with stress was gone, replaced by someone who was finally beginning to understand the cost of his choices. Whether redemption was possible remained to be seen, but at least recognition had begun. Brenda's fate was quite different. Her complete isolation was self-imposed and absolute. Even Mark, whose life she had helped destroy, wanted nothing to do with her. The woman who had once commanded social gatherings with her charm and manipulation was now a pariah, abandoned by everyone who had once sought her approval. But the most meaningful development was Lisa's tentative approach toward reconciliation. 3 months after the trial concluded, she appeared at my front door with tears streaming down her face and a humility I had never seen in her before. "Mom," she said, her voice breaking before she could continue. "I don't know how to begin to apologize for what I allowed to happen to you. I was so afraid of Mark and Brenda, so worried about my own family's financial situation, that I convinced myself you really were confused about Dad's intentions." She spent hours that afternoon telling me about the fear that had paralyzed her during the months of my persecution, the way Mark and Brenda had systematically isolated family members who might have supported me, the threats about her children's security if she didn't cooperate with their narrative. I kept telling myself that if I just stayed quiet, if I didn't take sides somehow, everything would work out, she said through her tears. But I was taking sides by my silence. I was choosing their lies over your truth, and I'm so ashamed of the coward I became. More importantly, Lisa spoke about her commitment to rebuilding our relationship through actions rather than words. She had already begun therapy to understand her own complicity and to develop the courage to stand up for truth even when it was difficult or costly. Emma and Samuel, now 16 and 18, had been deeply traumatized by their father's imprisonment and the revelation of his crimes. But they were also old enough to understand that they had been manipulated into participating in my humiliation, and their remorse was genuine and profound. "Grandma," Emma said during one of their first visits to my home, "I'm so sorry for the things I said about you and the way I acted at those events. I believed Dad and Brenda when they said you were sick, but I should have trusted my own memories of who you really are." Samuel's approach was more complex, but equally meaningful. At 18, he was struggling with the realization that his entire understanding of family values had been built on lies and manipulation. "I want to learn how to be the kind of person you and Grandpa were," he told me with the earnestness of someone trying to rebuild his moral foundation. "I want to understand what real integrity looks like." As I sat in my reclaimed home that evening, surrounded by Lisa and her children for the first time in over a year, I felt the complex weight of a victory that had come at enormous cost. Arthur's charitable legacy was secure, my reputation was restored, and justice had been served. But the price had been the destruction of relationships that could never be fully repaired, and the exposure of family dysfunction that would take years to heal. Yet underneath the sadness was something else, the profound satisfaction of knowing that vulnerable veterans would receive help because I had found the courage to fight for Arthur's true intentions, and that my grandchildren would grow up understanding the difference between entitlement and service, between self-interest and genuine love. The battle for my family's soul had been won, but the work of rebuilding what remained was just beginning. 3 years have passed since the trial that vindicated Arthur's intentions and exposed the depth of my family's betrayal. And as I sit in my garden this peaceful morning, watching the sunrise illuminate the flowers that Arthur and I planted together decades ago, I can honestly say that my life has been transformed in ways I never could have imagined during those dark months of persecution and abandonment. The financial restitution from the court case, combined with the settlement of various civil suits against Mark and Brenda, restored my economic security and allowed me to reclaim the comfortable, independent lifestyle that they had tried to destroy. But more importantly, the legal victory gave me something that money could never provide, the validation that my fight for truth and justice had been worth the enormous personal cost. My home, which had once felt like a mausoleum filled with painful memories of Arthur's deception and my children's betrayal, has been transformed into a warm, welcoming space that reflects both my past accomplishments and my renewed sense of purpose. The walls now display not just family photographs, but also awards and recognition for my work in elder advocacy letters from veterans whose lives have been changed by hope and healings programs, and pictures from speaking engagements where I share my story with audiences who need to hear that survival and redemption are possible even after the most devastating betrayals. My relationship with Lisa has blossomed into something more authentic and meaningful than it ever was during the years when we both lived with Arthur's secrets and our family's unspoken tensions. The Lisa who had been paralyzed by fear and financial anxiety has been replaced by a woman who has learned to prioritize truth and compassion over social expectations and material security. Mom, she told me recently as we worked together in the garden, I feel like I'm getting to know you for the first time as an adult. All those years when I was too worried about my own problems to really see what an extraordinary person you are, what an incredible life you've built through service and integrity. We spend several hours together each week, not out of obligation or guilt, but because we genuinely enjoy each other's company and have discovered that we share values and interests that our family's dysfunction had previously obscured. Lisa has become my partner in various charitable activities, using her marketing skills to help promote elder abuse awareness and ethical estate planning. Emma and Samuel, now 18 and 20, have embraced their grandmother's true story with the enthusiasm of young adults who have discovered that their family history is far more inspiring than they had been led to believe. They spend time with me not because they're required to, but because they value my perspective and want to learn from my experiences. Grandma, Samuel told me during our last conversation, learning about what you went through and how you fought for what was right has completely changed how I think about family money and responsibility. I want to build a life that would make you and Grandpa proud, based on service rather than selfishness. Emma has channeled her artistic talents into creating materials for hope and healings awareness campaigns, designing brochures and websites that help other families understand the warning signs of elder abuse and the importance of respecting elderly relatives' charitable intentions. The relationship with Mark remains complex and necessarily distant. His letters from prison arrive monthly, filled with updates about his therapy progress and his growing understanding of the psychological patterns that led to his criminal behavior. While genuine reconciliation may never be possible, there is at least honesty between us now, a recognition of truth that allows for the possibility of eventual healing. I'm learning to understand the difference between wanting forgiveness and deserving it. His most recent letter read, I may never deserve your forgiveness for what I did to you, but I'm trying to become someone who could be worthy of it, even if that takes the rest of my life. Brenda has faded into complete irrelevance, living a solitary existence that stands in stark contrast to the vibrant, purposeful life I have built from the ashes of her attempts to destroy me. Sometimes I hear updates about her through mutual acquaintances, descriptions of a bitter, isolated woman consumed by the consequences of her own choices. I feel no satisfaction in her suffering, only a profound sadness for the waste of human potential that comes from choosing manipulation over authenticity. But perhaps the most meaningful aspect of my transformation has been my emergence as a national advocate for elder rights, ethical estate planning, and charitable giving. Working with Eleanor Martinez at Hope and Healing with Patricia Williams in the philanthropic community, and with the legal team that secured my victory, I have become a voice for countless elderly people who face similar exploitation by family members who prioritize inheritance over integrity. My memoir, Fighting for Truth, An Elder's Battle Against Family Fraud, became a bestseller and sparked national conversations about the hidden epidemic of elder abuse disguised as family concern. The book tour took me to dozens of cities where I spoke to packed auditoriums about the warning signs of financial exploitation and the importance of supporting elderly relatives' autonomy even when their decisions don't align with family expectations. Your age does not diminish your right to make your own choices about your money and your values, I tell audiences wherever I speak. Your need for support does not make you vulnerable to manipulation, and your family's financial needs do not override your right to determine your own legacy. The speaking engagements and advocacy work have given my life a sense of purpose that extends far beyond personal recovery. I work with legislators to strengthen elder protection laws, with estate planning attorneys to develop better safeguards against family coercion, and with charitable organizations to protect their donors from exactly the kind of intimidation that Arthur and I experienced. Most importantly, I mentor other elder abuse survivors, helping them find their voices, navigate the legal system, and rebuild their lives after betrayal by those they trusted most. My home has become a gathering place for a support group of people who understand the unique pain of family exploitation and the complex process of healing from systematic emotional abuse. Every evening, as I sit in my comfortable chair overlooking the garden where native wildflowers now grow alongside the roses Arthur planted, I feel a profound sense of completion that has nothing to do with revenge or vindication. The abuse I endured was devastating, but it led to a purpose and a platform that I never could have achieved without that terrible journey through darkness. Arthur's charitable legacy lives on through the veterans who receive mental health support funded by his donation. My own legacy is being built through the awareness and legal protections that my case helped establish, ensuring that other elderly people will have better safeguards against exactly the kind of exploitation we experienced. The woman who had once lived with secrets and endured systematic betrayal had found her voice, her purpose, and her peace. Ruth Peterson was no longer just a survivor. She was a leader, an advocate, and a beacon of hope for anyone who had ever been told they were too old, too vulnerable, or too inconvenient to matter. The truth I had fought so hard to protect had not only been vindicated, it had become a force for protecting others who face similar battles against greed, manipulation, and the cruel assumption that elderly people's voices don't matter as much as their money. As I sit in my sunroom this quiet Sunday morning, watching the light filter through the stained glass window that Arthur and I chose together 40 years ago, I find myself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that brought me from the depths of family betrayal to this moment of profound peace and purposeful contentment. At 73, I am not the same woman who was ambushed by her own children's greed 3 years ago, stripped of her dignity, and nearly destroyed by systematic abuse disguised as family concern. The home that was once threatened with foreclosure now serves as both my sanctuary and my headquarters for the advocacy work that gives my days meaning and direction. The rooms that once echoed with loneliness and betrayal are now frequently filled with the voices of Lisa and her children colleagues from my advocacy work and fellow survivors who find strength in our shared commitment to truth and justice. Most importantly, Arthur's charitable legacy has been not just preserved, but amplified through the national attention our case received. The $2.4 million he designated for hope and healing has funded mental health programs that have helped hundreds of veterans, while the awareness generated by our legal battle has led to increased donations and expanded services that touch thousands of lives. Through my advocacy work, my memoir, and my speaking engagements, I have transformed the pain of my personal betrayal into a powerful force for protecting other elderly people from similar exploitation. The laws that have been strengthened, the families that have been educated about elder abuse, warning signs, and the charitable organizations that now have better protections against donor intimidation all represent a living legacy that extends far beyond my individual experience. Perhaps most importantly, I have learned that dignity cannot be taken from you. It can only be surrendered. The systematic abuse I endured was designed to convince me that I was powerless, incompetent, and voiceless. But beneath the manipulation and lies, Ruth Peterson, the woman who had spent 38 years fighting for justice and protecting vulnerable people, was still alive and waiting for her moment to reclaim her truth. To anyone who may be listening to my story while facing their own battles with family betrayal, financial exploitation, or the challenge of maintaining autonomy in the face of those who would control you, I want you to know this: your voice has power, your choices matter, and your right to determine your own legacy is sacred, regardless of what others may claim about your competence or their own entitlement to your resources. The path I walked was more difficult than I ever imagined possible, but it led to a place of peace and purpose that no one can ever take away from me. The betrayal I endured was devastating, but it was not the end of my story. It was the beginning of my most important chapter, one where I learned that true victory comes not from defeating your enemies, but from transforming your pain into protection for others and living with the unshakable knowledge that you have remained true to your deepest values regardless of the cost. Today, as I prepare for another week of meaningful work surrounded by people who respect and value my contributions, I can say with absolute certainty that integrity does triumph, that truth will ultimately prevail, and that it is never too late to reclaim your voice and fight for what matters most. The mountain I climbed was built not of stone and earth, but of human greed and systematic cruelty, and reaching its summit taught me that no force on earth is stronger than a person who refuses to surrender their dignity and their commitment to justice, no matter how long the battle or how high the personal cost.